working on the Scarlatti video? Yeah, finally. And I'm almost done too, but... Okay, so he wrote 555 keyboard sonatas, right? Oh, please tell me you're gonna talk about more than just that. You at least gotta mention the king who didn't change his clothes for a year and a half. Of course. But you gotta get those sweet juicy clicks somehow. I'm at an impasse though. 555 is too big a number to just say. Like, I want to show everybody something so we can get our brains around that. Thing is, I just don't think I have 555 of anything. What about rice? Somehow, I just think that's going to be underwhelming. Let's see, you got some lentils? Hey, get down from there. Look, I don't know where you're going to find that many of something and have it actually be impressive. Hey, why don't you go on a field trip and see if you can find something? Like, you know I don't got any money. And put it on the company card. Alright, see ya. In the meantime, we can at least get started. I might not have a visual aid yet, but to put this in perspective another way, if you were to write a sonata every week, it would take you over a decade to write as many as he did. And he was writing tone clusters like these before Mozart was even born. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Domenico Scarlatti. Domenico Scarlatti was born in October 1685, the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach, and was one of many middle children in the family of Alessandro Scarlatti, who was 25 when his sixth kid was born. To put this in perspective, I'm 25 right now and I have 0 kids that you know of. Please don't call me daddy in the comments. I'm not ready for that kind of pressure. At the time, the Scarlattis were living in Naples. Italy would not be a unified country for another 2 centuries or so, and regional differences remain profound to this day. The Scarlattis were Sicilian by heritage, but Domenico had siblings who were born in Rome. There was a good amount of soap opera-like intrigue surrounding Alessandro's Neapolitan post. He was a go-getter who wrote an enormous amount of music, and the story of Domenico's first few decades is bound up inextricably with his father's career. Alessandro was involved in the theater. Operas were written at breakneck speed, and opportunities took him all across the peninsula. This illustrates an important distinction between the Scarlattis and Bachs as musical families. Bachs were established at church organist positions in German-speaking lands, whereas the Scarlattis, well, when you combined Alessandro's peripatetic activities with the lack of any evidence that Domenico ever attended a conservatory in Naples or anywhere else, we have to assume that Domenico learned music from his father by lending him a helping hand with these theatrical productions. Although Alessandro's fame as a teacher wouldn't get going until some time later, evidence shows a father overwhelmingly concerned for his kids' education. Men had lower life expectancies back then. Well, everyone had lower life expectancies, but men were expected to get their careers going and start families as soon as possible. So when Domenico was 15, he got his first known music job, organist and composer at the Royal Neapolitan Palace, where his dad was also working. But as soon as Domenico started there, the War of the Spanish Succession kicked off. The Kingdom of Naples was a part of the Spanish Empire, which was embroiled in political turmoil and terrorist plots as France and Austria fought over Spanish dominions. This was the last straw for the Scarlattis at a court that Alessandro felt continually disrespected at. Being a court composer really wasn't the best employment. Oftentimes you couldn't quit even if you wanted to, and this delayed father and son's first known trip together up to Florence in the summer of 1702. Alessandro thought he had an in with the Grand Duke, and it was there that Domenico wrote his first known works, some cantatas. But Alessandro, try as he might, could not get an appointment in the Florentine court, and settled for a less prestigious job in Rome as assistant music director at the Basilica of St. Mary Major. Rome wasn't an ideal place for theatrical composers because popes instituted regulations that were an undue burden on the opera world. They banned admission fees, they forced singers to choose between the opera and the church, they kept women from the stage, and all of this successfully tanked the business model. This period coincided with Domenico's first operas, performed in late 1703. His extended family had a hand in their production, but these weren't works of genius. The kid was only 18, and he was competent in the kind of generic mid-Baroque opera that was common at the time. Alessandro wanted Domenico to land the best job possible, so he sent him to Venice along with Niccolò Grimaldi, one of the era's most famous singers and a noted interpreter of Alessandro's opera roles. Venice was the European Las Vegas. There's a reason there's a place in Las Vegas today called the Venetian, I think. Music was everywhere, opera houses abounded, and the parties just did not stop. The population's notorious licentiousness was a part of a musical industrial complex. Antonio Vivaldi taught at the Ospedale della Pietà and composed for its orchestra. There were a lot of girls who were deposited there as unwanted infants, and I think you can do the math as to how this relates to Venetian behavior. In addition to hearing Vivaldi's music, Scarlatti was mentored by leading Venetian opera composer Francesco Gasparini, a friend of Alessandro, who was also the choir master at the Pietà and a celebrated teacher. As important as his Venetian network was, it was nothing compared to his exact contemporary Georg Friedrich Handel, who was taking Europe by storm and visited the Italian regions in the late 1700s. His harpsichord playing was good, but his organ prowess was the stuff of legend. Scarlatti and Handel likely engaged in a musical duel where they went back and forth on their respective instruments, and depending on whose story you trust, Scarlatti either tied Handel or slightly edged him out on the harpsichord, but Handel could not be beat at the organ console. The two were very good friends for the time that Handel was in the Italian regions, but they never crossed paths again after Handel went back north in late 1709. Scarlatti was, if nothing else, very good at playing the harpsichord, but what we don't know is what a lot of these early pieces were like. For a guy with so many keyboard sonatas to his name, it's ironic that we cannot place his works in any sort of timeline. Since we don't have many first-hand accounts of who Scarlatti was like as a person, scholars have had to rely on inferences. Often they rely on extrapolations of his music to say something about his character, which is a totally dangerous game to play. We don't know how much of his operatic interest, for instance, was pushed upon him by his dad. He had 2 known public performances of his operas. The rest were private performances. This is a much different connotation today. Private musical performances were not uncommon. It was a way for composers to attract a more discerning, thoughtful, and intelligent crowd than the over-the-top rowdiness that characterized a lot of the public theater. Scholars look at this and say, well, Scarlatti wanted to avoid the opera, he had a later interest in intimate keyboard music, there was no first-hand accounts, he married much later in life than people usually did back then, and all of this combines as circumstantial evidence that he was shy. One scholar, Malcolm Boyd, semi-seriously proposed that Scarlatti engaged in a cover-up and destroyed all traces of his career that he could find. The son of a major opera composer who would end up near the top of the musical food chain at a major European court just simply wouldn't suffer this fate. We don't even know basic answers to questions about huge chunks of Scarlatti's life, which is a far cry from this era of music when musicologists are usually asked to extract truths from webs of complex fiction. Back in Rome, Scarlatti met Queen Marie Casimira of Poland, known commonly as Maryszinka, who took over the peculiar role of arts patron / monarch in exile that had started a generation before with Christina, Queen of Sweden, who had abdicated her throne after a long history of patronage and engaging in Rome's intellectual life. Christina had been a patron to Alessandro, and while Maryszinka was universally recognized as Christina's intellectual inferior, at least she had her heart in the right place and tried to take over her role. When Domenico began working for her, she was nearly 70, and Scarlatti began composing for her around Lent, when he wrote an oratorio. Opera at that point was banned during Lent, which led to the rise of these unstaged sacred stories with the same forces known as oratorios. In today's language, Maryszinka was a self-absorbed drama queen. In order to keep her happy, the subject matter of Scarlatti's works would bend towards obsequious flattery towards her. But soon she ran out of money. Actually, she'd been running out of money for a while and was known to pay people off by giving them random noble titles. Most of Scarlatti's dramatic music of this era was composed for particular occasions and has been lost. What does survive indicates a composer who wasn't nearly as home in these dramatic forms as his father was, someone who hadn't quite come into his own. By the end of 1714, his connections at the Vatican, likely helped out by his father, became a springboard for his next post. He was the assistant to Tommaso Bai, Maestro di Cappella at the Cappella Giulia, throughout 1714. But Scarlatti does not appear on the Vatican payroll until February 1715, when he succeeded Bai after Bai's death. Scarlatti wrote sacred music and played the organ, But again, it's irritating for scholars because not much of it is left. The Vatican archives aren't helpful, as music written by composers in Scarlatti's position were the personal property of the composers. We do have a Stabat Mater for 10 voices, which you'll often see cited as his first masterpiece, or at least his first surviving one at any rate. He also nabbed a Maestro di Capella post for the Portuguese ambassador, which was a good financial move because Portugal had a lot of money flowing in from the gold from their colony in Brazil. Around this time, the papal restrictions on opera had been relaxed, and Roman theaters now enjoyed more productions than they used to. This offered more opportunities for composers than librettists because Romans loved the old stories, but expected new music to update the stories to fit the day's changing aesthetic tastes. Scarlatti wrote music for a version of Hamlet and then never again returned to public opera performances. He'd take one last stab at the theater in 1718 and then didn't go near the genre for good. The specter of his father in this realm was strong, and it's likely Alessandro was interfering in Domenico's affairs to at least some extent. This gets exaggerated in some accounts because of the utter lack of information, but it doesn't diminish the fact that in January 1717, at the age of 32, it took legal action, a court document, for Alessandro to give up his paternal rights and fully emancipate his son. In summer 1719, Domenico quit his Italian job and landed in Portugal. Portugal was, at this point, a patriarchy. This is a word with feminist sociological connotations today, but in Roman Catholicism, the term patriarch just refers to a bishop of high rank. The Portuguese king, John V, was eager to curry favor with Pope Clement XI, and various popes gave the new Patriarchate of Lisbon all sorts of special perks, including some usually reserved for the Pope himself. The quid pro quo was that Portugal helped the Vatican side in the Austro-Turkish War. While the relationship between the Portuguese monarchy on the one hand and the Catholic Church on the other would get rocky, even with subsequent Portuguese popes, Lisbon had more money than they could spend by the time that Scarlatti got there, and they spent that on recreating the best of the music of the Vatican. Scarlatti fit right in, although once again, we don't know nearly as much as we'd like, because a massive earthquake in 1755 that seismologists estimate at a whopping 8.4 on the Richter scale destroyed almost 90% of Lisbon's buildings. In addition to composing and performing duties, Scarlatti taught harpsichord lessons to the king's brother, Don Antonio, and the king's daughter, Maria Barbara, who would later become Queen of Spain. She would come to treasure Scarlatti's friendship for the rest of her life. The organist of the chapel, Carlos Seixas, was a prodigy on the instrument and a composer of keyboard sonatas in his own right. Scarlatti told Don Antonio that Seixas was so good that he could give him lessons. The comparison of these two keyboard titans is irresistible, but how much they may have influenced one another is still a wide open discussion. As wealthy as Portugal was, it was not to be Scarlatti's permanent base of operations. He returned to Rome the year before his father died, and 3 years after that, the 42-year-old Scarlatti married a 16-year-old Roman girl named Maria Catalina Gentili. His favorite pupil, Maria Barbara, was engaged to Ferdinand VI, the future king of Spain. Royal marriages were entirely political, and the royals of Spain and Portugal had arranged this as one of 2 such weddings some years in advance, known as the Exchange of the Princesses. John V ordered Scarlatti to Spain, which would be his permanent home. Like Joseph Haydn years later, Scarlatti's distance from the rest of the European musical scene forced him to become original. Without this, Alessandro might be the only Scarlatti we talk about. The royal couple were known as the Prince and Princess of the Asturias, and were based in Seville. Life in the Spanish royal family was upside down as King Philip V suffered from severe depression on top of other mental illnesses, and kept an exhausting, irregular schedule, leaving his wife, Queen Elizabeth Farnese, in charge. The music-loving princess and her melancholy husband used music as a form of stress relief. It was also music therapy at the court. The queen was desperate for some amelioration for the notoriously music-agnostic king's depression, so she invited the famous castrato Farinelli to show up to sing for him in 1737. He was such a hit that he was named chamber musician to the king and never gave a public concert again. Farinelli was a natural at navigating the court and became close to the Prince and Princess of the Asturias, and thus to Scarlatti, despite the queen's open dislike of them. The only way the queen could hang on to power was to keep her husband from abdicating again. He'd actually done that before. She didn't even let him hold a pen lest he sign abdication papers, and she had a vested interest in sowing the seeds of mistrust in the family. Stuck in a circumscribed position in the royal hierarchy through the machinations of her mother-in-law, the only power the Princess of the Asturias had was to put in a good word with her father back in Portugal, who granted Scarlatti a knighthood in 1738. Scarlatti was so indebted to the king that he dedicated his first published collection of keyboard pieces to him. It's only with these exercises, published when he was 53, that Scarlatti breaks out of the mold of forgettable court composer into the keyboard composer with a unique voice that we know and love today. Farinelli's presence at the court did nothing to stop the king's descent into madness. Philip insisted that Farinelli sing the same 5 arias as he had had that first night, every night, month after month after month after month. And even in an era of little bathing, Philip was known to go up to 18 months without so much as changing his clothes. He would imitate Farinelli, but he was untrained, he was all but tone deaf, and had gone through puberty, all things that Farinelli wasn't. The result was a screeching nightmare for anyone who had to attend to him and pretend that everything was okay with the king. His sudden death in July 1746 was probably a blessing for a man trapped in a role that he hated in an era that could not comprehend his illness. The queen, now dowager, insisted on retaining the reins of power any way she possibly could, but by July 1747 she was sent away after the new king and queen got sick of her drama. Now Scarlatti was a trusted musician to the new queen and a central figure in an enlivened Spanish court that prized music. But the dynamics of the new royal couple were unfortunately not unlike the old. Ferdinand had inherited his father's gloominess, but Maria Barbara wasn't nearly as conniving as her old mother-in-law, and her centrality to the court meant that Scarlatti and Farinelli had far greater roles. Farinelli had supplanted Scarlatti in the queen's favor, and Spaniards openly wondered if he was actually the one in charge. This worked because Farinelli was a man of great honor and routinely turned down massive bribes from other courts. His annual salary in Spain was as much as he made in a single opera season. Scarlatti, who never seemed to have many ambitions greater than that of a court composer, didn't feel shown up by Farinelli, who sang duets with the queen and was an obvious choice to take over the court's opera productions. Scarlatti, a pretty old guy for the time, committed himself to writing keyboard sonatas for the queen's private amusement. Within the hundreds he produced, he explored all emotional affects, the sounds of Spanish music, and so much more that we're going to get into just now. First, we have to know the naming convention, the K numbers, which stand for Ralph Kirkpatrick, a pioneering harpsichordist and Scarlatti scholar who published the first comprehensive English language study of Scarlatti in 1953. While alternative numbering systems exist, the K numbers are the standard. Opus numbers aren't helpful because only a little over 70 of Scarlatti's pieces were published during his lifetime, which was pretty good considering the lack of publication in that era. It's a reason that so many Baroque pieces have been lost. Scarlatti once said that he was convinced that he had broken all of the rules of composition, but that he really only cared about one rule, and that's, did it sound good? While instrumental music allowed for liberties with voice leading that vocal music did not, hence the term voice leading, Scarlatti's departures are striking. In K394 we have chains of parallel root position triads, leading to parallel fifths. The classic workaround is to put these in first inversion, but Scarlatti wants that triadic sound here. Still further afield are the series of intervals in K222, which lead to bare parallel sevenths. These stylistic aberrations often destabilize music in the lead up to a cadence, with the structural goal of making the cadences sound like they're really settling in on something stable. They may also be explained as Scarlatti's attempt at breaking counterpoint in a way that worked, as various pamphlet wars had broken out between competing composers and theorists of the day about how to use dissonance. It's fairly well documented that Claudio Monteverdi and Giovanni Artusi got into it in the beginning of the 17th century, but this was still very much a debate in Spain during Scarlatti's time too. Francisco Valls and Joaquin Martinez squabbled from 1715 through 1720, which involved Alessandro Scarlatti's comment, and in the mid-1750s, Jaime Casillas and Josep Duran bickered, where Duran, to justify his dissonances, cited the example of Domenico Scarlatti as someone who violated the rules in an expressive and tasteful way. Scarlatti manages to modulate without emphasizing seventh chords, the way that later composers did. Typically, we see the 5-7-1 motion as being so strong that if you want to modulate to a new key, you have to use the dominant of the new key in order to get there. But Scarlatti didn't think of harmony in this way. Kirkpatrick posited that Scarlatti, according to the music theory of his day, thought of seventh chords not as entities in their own right, but as superpositions of two different chords. Note that the terms dominant and subdominant to describe these tones was still some ways away. But in Scarlatti's time, they still function like that. We learned that the seventh of this chord should resolve down by step because it's part of a tritone, which is a dissonant interval, and it needs to go to the third of that next chord. But Scarlatti treats this note, the seventh of the 5-7, as though it's the root of a 4 chord, which resolves plaguily by skipping to the tonic. Scarlatti's use of the pedal point technique, which is usually in the bass because it's named after the pedals on the organ, is unconventional because he often throws them into the inner voices, and often on notes that correspond to the open strings of the Spanish guitar. Guitars operate so differently from keyboard instruments that composers who write on guitar, like Hector Berlioz in the next century, have very different harmonic languages from composers who work from the keyboard. Consider also the sound of the harpsichord and the sound of the guitar. They're both plucked strings, so they're gonna sound similar. Scholarship has a hard time with Scarlatti because his music does not fit neatly into one form. It breaks the rules of voice leading that are commonly taught in music theory classes up to the present day, and Scarlatti was also constantly changing things up from piece to piece. 9 sonatas are clearly multi-movement, 7 are fugues, 4 are rondos, and only 1, K61, is a theme and variation. Most are in 2-part or binary form, with Scarlatti settling into a pattern of a freer second half of the music to round out a more steady, predictable, and square first half. But there is no such thing as a typical Scarlatti sonata. As Kirkpatrick put it, the only way of illustrating the anatomy of the Scarlatti sonata is to establish a kind of theoretical fixed point from which the sonatas themselves consistently depart. This fixed point is a binary form, where a primary key modulates into a secondary key in the first half, then reverses harmonic course after a double bar line in the middle of the work. These are not linked to themes or even primary and secondary key areas. You can't call this first half the exposition, because the second half is neither a development nor a recapitulation. The high classical sonata that Haydn pioneered allied particular themes to key areas, and this is not true in Scarlatti. The successions of Scarlatti's themes have nothing to do with the harmonic structure. That is, if you take a formal analysis of the key areas and a formal analysis of the themes that appear, they might line up, but there's no guarantee that they will. And this ambiguity helps Scarlatti write binary forms while hinting at 3-part structures. You never know where he's going to go next, and yet it all sounds very cohesive and intentional. He took keyboard technique a step further by popularizing such now common devices as hand crossings. K120 has some of the most extreme in the whole keyboard literature. K299 shows us how huge leaps, even without crossing them, factors into his playing style. There are competing theories as to what initiated this creative development. One links back to his belated emancipation, that this stalled his creative development, and it's only after he abandoned stage works, that he abandoned his father, that he was able to do his own thing. The second interpretation is that he had improvised music like this for some time, and the Queen encouraged him, during a period of illness, to write them down so that they could be preserved for posterity. The third is money. Scarlatti was known to gamble. Farinelli paid Scarlatti's debts and made sure his kids were taken care of after he died. Not like the Scarlattis were destitute. Farinelli was just a genuinely good dude. He was sick and rarely left his home by the mid-1750s. In addition to his huge body of sonatas, he also wrote a few sacred works, one of which, a setting of Salve Regina for soprano and strings, is believed to be his final work. Oh wait, hold on. My phone's going off. Go for Thomas. Hey. Guess what? I came up with a great idea. Oh, cool. What'd you get? Okay, so you know that pet store on 5th and 78th? You lived here longer, so I'm going to go with you on that one. Well, coming soon to our apartment is delivery of 570 of Western New York's finest medium to large size rodents. Might be an unwise use of my time to lead with this question, but it's the wrong number. Well, you gotta account for attrition on transit. I mean, the smallest are gonna get trampled or eaten. I am canceling that transaction right now. That is insane. Not to mention a huge violation of our lease. Okay, calm down. Let me talk to him. From 1752 until 1757, 13 volumes of Scarlatti's sonatas were copied out from Maria Barbara, in addition to previous volumes from 1742 and 1749. These 15 volumes comprise 496 sonatas, all of which were deposited in Venice in 1835. Additionally, 463 sonatas, many duplicates, were collected and bound together and now live in a library in Parma. Farinelli inherited Scarlatti's manuscripts and instruments, and despite the wishes in Farinelli's will, these were dispersed upon his death in 1782. This all contributes to what musicologists call, in technical terms, an absolute mess. They've had to piece through this scattered wreckage, correct errors, and at least try to put them in chronological order, all of which is easier said than done. Oh, and a handful of additional collections, each of which has at least a few bonus sonatas not found elsewhere, cropped up in Germany, one of which, containing 308 sonatas, was once owned by Johannes Brahms, a Scarlatti enthusiast. Some early ones show up in collections of pieces largely by Carlos Seixas. Compounding this further was the fact that across these collections, sonatas often appeared in pairs, usually sharing a tonic, but not necessarily sharing a mode. At least some were designed to be played a tocca, although Scarlatti needed to explain what he wanted, since that was far from a common instruction. 388 of the sonatas are in pairs, with a further 12 bound together in groups of 3. Collections of sonatas were haphazardly circulated, and their fame varied widely from place to place. In England, where there was a Scarlatti cult in the North American colonies, Scarlatti's music was widely sought after by keyboardists. Charles Wesley was among his fans. He was a minor name in the rest of Europe, save for Italy, where, ironically, he was barely known. He died in July 1757, 3 months before he would have turned 72. To this day, there are Scarlattis in Madrid who are descendants of Domenico. Less than a year later, the Queen died after a long illness, and the King went so mad that he committed suicide by constipation. Cannot make this stuff up. There are more details, but I would get demonetized for even trying to describe them, and maybe arrested in some jurisdictions. The tumultuous but highly musical era of Spanish royal history came to an ignominious end when the new king, Carlos III, made it clear that the bizarre schedules and depressive episodes of previous monarchs would cease, and along with them, Farinelli's usefulness. The castrato retired to Bologna, where English musicologist Charles Burney came to visit. What Farinelli told Burney constitutes the bulk of our knowledge of who Scarlatti was like as a person. Only a small handful of manuscripts survived, which only emerged in the 1970s. And as taste in tuning systems evolved, Scarlatti's weird modulations were often corrected by those who thought they were looking at genuine mistakes. Take a look at this modulation in K206. Dissonance is also front and center in a number of famous moments. K115's dissonance works because it's underpinned by a standard harmonic progression. He plays fast and loose with them, but they're there. For Scarlatti, the third of the chord, the mediant, which defines whether a chord is major or minor, is freely malleable. In an inversion of the standard Baroque practice of the Picardy third, where minor pieces end with a major chord, Scarlatti was free to do the opposite, like in K107. K119 has the most extreme dissonance that music would know for some time, as Scarlatti let notes from different chords, which have different functions, pile up into a D minor cluster. Regardless of how you want to analyze this, no other composer did this kind of thing. Of course, you can also analyze this as a bunch of dissonant added tones to a central chord, and maybe that's a good lens for other kinds of dissonances that occur in Scarlatti, such as what happens in K175. As mentioned, figuring out when these pieces come from is a huge challenge. Kirkpatrick attempted this, and his best guess was that most, if not all of them, were composed after 1735, and most after 1752. A controversial conclusion bolstered by the advances in harpsichord technology that is reflected in the ranges that Scarlatti used, but still, just an incomprehensible level of productivity compressed into such a short period of time, an impossibly short period of time. Kirkpatrick, after devoting so much time to researching these pieces and comparing them, couldn't hardly believe it. He knew that it sounds crazy that this old sick guy would, in the final half-decade of his life, produce such an incredible and diverse collection. When Kirkpatrick writes about this, it's almost like he's trying to convince himself that maybe this should have caused him to reconsider. If we take Kirkpatrick at his word and be a little generous with the numbers and say that 75% of all Scarlatti sonatas were written between 1752 and 1757, this is 416 pieces in 5 years, about 83 pieces per year. And if he started this pace when he was 30, Scarlatti would have produced 3,413 keyboard sonatas. Gotta make a call. Go for Feldman. Can you get 3,413 of something? You can go to Wegmans yourself. Or maybe the beach. Well, look, I'm already filming and you're already out and about. Wait, hold on, where are you now? I'm in your office. I think I've maybe shaken the pet store people. Oh gosh, the things I put up with. I tell you what, I am under no obligation to keep having you on my couch. You remember how I evicted Bach? You said he got run over by a bus. Yeah, he did after I kicked him out for getting schnitzel crumbs all over the carpet. I tell you what, I'll make it up to you. I'll do the outro, okay? I don't have an outro. Well, you should. I'll plug your Patreon or something. The Kirkpatrick volume has remained a gold standard because he always makes sure to show why he comes to his conclusions while reinforcing their inherently speculative nature, which has stood him well as some of his conclusions have since been contradicted. Where Kirkpatrick falls short is that he has two cases and he conflates them. One is that these sonatas were copied out roughly in the order in which they were composed, which is backed up by traces of stylistic development. The second is the idea that Scarlatti was just churning these things out and then they were getting compiled and bound together as soon as he had finished enough pieces for a collection. That is the controversial contention. Alternative chronologies space out the sonatas over the course of Scarlatti's career, but even doing that is based off of the notion that the pairs of sonatas are meaningful in terms of their chronology. Not just pieces in the same tonic that got slapped together for publication. Modern scholarship doesn't take the pair theory seriously, regardless of when the sonatas that make up such pairs were written. We should bear in mind that systems of tuning were still far from standardized, evidenced by Scarlatti's hesitancy to write in any key signature that went too sharp or too flat. Scholars are forced to rely on the ordered binding of Scarlatti's sonatas to give a framework for a chronology, and what bolsters this is analyzing the range of his pieces. Keyboard technology was rapidly developing, and this meant more notes on the newest and best instruments. Scholarship has also tracked virtuosic tricks like hand crossing. Because the Queen's ill health led to a drastic increase in her physical circumference, the leaping figures found in early Scarlatti sonatas don't make a whole lot of sense if he was writing for someone who would have had difficulty performing it. Then again, does a lack of hand crossings mean that maybe Scarlatti wrote a given sonata or a set of sonatas later? What if he wrote them earlier and he just chose not to include that as a technique? Scarlatti also falls into the awkward historical position between late Baroque and early classical eras, and he problematizes our view of this often swept aside period because his music doesn't fit into the simple phrases that classify this transitional stage. He looks forward more so to Chopin's take on dance forms. Both composers will take dances and screw with them in order to render them recognizable to our ears, but impossible to physically dance to. Take a look at the phrases in K305, which cut across the bar line, and in an irregular fashion at that. 502 has a bunch of time signature shifts that further obscure any sense of regularity. Structure and phrase length and voice leading get messed with in equal measure. In his analysis of the sonatas, W. Dean Sutcliffe, pictured here in his best Hamburglar outfit, makes the point that rhythmic devices, which Western theory usually glosses over, are at the heart of the Scarlatti sonatas. Scarlatti's sense of when to and not to repeat things accounts for his uniqueness and the reticence of scholars to engage in meaningful analysis. It's easier to just not talk about proportionality than to come up with language that can describe it. For instance, Scarlatti might lop off a critical measure when a section repeats, which is so non-standard that editors and performers put them back in to make two sections line up. In K96, standard phrase lengths are interrupted by one measure that many performers use as the basis for short improvisations. These performers take liberties with the structure just to make sure the harmonic rhythm and phrasing is more in keeping with what other composers were doing. Thinking about proportion is the only way that we can comprehensively explain repetitive, insistently non-melodic sections of Scarlatti's sonatas, commonly referred to as the vamp sections, like this example from K409. These vamp sections will stymie our progress through a Scarlatti sonata if we're tracking the forward progression of motifs and phrases for our analysis. There's also a decidedly political component to Scarlatti's reception, both in his time and in later times. He's often cited for his incorporation of the sounds of the Spanish guitar and stereotypical Spanish cadences, but later Italian critics saw the non-Spanish influences in the same music and had their reasons to reclaim Scarlatti for the sake of an emergent Italian nationalism. They had their political motivations and goals, but all the same, is it right for us to look at what is strange or unusual or original in Scarlatti's music and assume a link to Spanish influences not shared by other Italian expatriates? And if so, how much of this in Scarlatti's time was political? The styles that Scarlatti borrowed were not those of the aristocracy, but the persecuted lower classes. It wasn't until about a century after Scarlatti's death that flamenco shed its lower class reputation. Many of Scarlatti's pieces would have been playable on the court's pianos, as only a small number of the sonatas are written for an instrument with more than one manual, like K554, or specifically for the organ. It's impossible to say if Scarlatti may have had them in mind for more of them than we realize, but the lack of sustained notes and the inclusion of fairly harsh dissonances all point to the harpsichord, which is better suited for most elements of his style. The best evidence that some of them may be intended for the piano are in octave doublings, like these from K487. Without the sustain pedal, octaves are all but impossible to play legato, which severely restricts their use in harpsichord and organ music right up through the present day. Scarlatti would have had access to forte pianos just after their conception, and he was close to the royals in Europe who would have had a keen interest in this nascent instrument. The first pieces ever written explicitly for the piano were by a composer named Lodovico Giustini, who dedicated a set of pieces to King John V's brother in 1732. It was not until around Scarlatti's death that they began to take up more cultural steam and evolved to gradually replace the harpsichord as the predominant keyboard instrument. There is only speculation that certain Scarlatti sonatas could be played on the piano, which was played quite often at the court to accompany Farinelli. Its delicate timbre and its eponymous dynamic control were perfect for that role. The Queen had 7 harpsichords and 5 pianos, and 2 of her harpsichords were converted pianos, which shows you how unimportant pianos were compared to harpsichords. Scarlatti is like any reclusive individual who may really only be known through their work. But this is a rabbit hole, and a potentially dangerous one at that. You can infer a chronology of the sonatas by stylistic traits in comparison to the technology that Scarlatti would have had at his disposal, but to say anything about the man behind those sonatas is impossible to do if you're just looking at the music. After all, there have been many composers in history whose music is unlike their personalities. Consider the delicate, quiet, and slow music of the brash and ebullient Morton Feldman.
Yeah, old Domenico's music is a little too short for my tastes, but I like the scale of writing so many of them pieces. Anyway, if you want to support music education on YouTube going forward, be sure to subscribe to the channel and consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. He's gonna need the money to bail me out of jail on fraud charges. Assuming they ever catch me.